Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The shocking objects buried in Queen Victoria's coffin. Queen Victoria was at the time the longest reigning British monarch when she died, and she would be surpassed by Queen Elizabeth II. Her death inside of Osborne House on the Isle of Wight shocked the whole world, and many members of her royal family had been summoned to her bedroom in a very small part of the huge royal residence. But the Queen would rally a number of times until she finally slipped away after suffering a number of strokes. However, the Queen left a number of specific requests following her death, and the funeral of Victoria and what happened afterwards is nothing short of chaos. As she had reigned for so long, no one knew how to plan a state funeral or what the protocol was for one. But in secret, the Queen had instructed her doctor to ensure that a few select items were placed in the coffin, and some of these would certainly have upset members of the royal family. Queen Victoria for some time had been ill, and she would arrange her funeral years before she passed away. She would die on the 22nd of January 1901 at 6:30 in the evening at the age of 81. Surrounding her were many of her grandchildren and also her children, and her eldest son Albert Edward would succeed her as Edward VII. Also present was Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and her favourite pet was laid upon her deathbed following her death. The instructions for the funeral and the mourning period had been written 4 years early, and she was to have a military funeral befitting a soldier's daughter and the head of the armed forces, and she wanted white instead of black. But chaos was happening on the Isle of Wight. The royal undertaker was summoned from London to prepare her body for burial and for the transportation of it back to England and back to London for the huge state proceedings. However, the undertaker famously forgot the Queen's coffin. Such was the haste he was in, and then a local carpenter was given the honours of making the Queen's funeral coffin. But she had passed instructions to her personal physician, Dr. Reed, who would dress the Queen in her coffin and also prepare her body to have a number of sentimental and special items placed. Some of these would have appalled members of the royal family. The first request that Victoria had was to be placed in the coffin was a plaster mould and cast of her late husband, Prince Albert's hands. Albert had died in 1861 at the age of 42, and the Queen never got over his loss, as Albert was a brilliant consort, but he was also the Queen's great love. Following his death, the royal physicians, upon Victoria's request, made a plaster cast of his hands to make sure that the Queen had a permanent reminder of his grasp. The first request was that these plaster casts should be placed in her coffin, along with one of Albert's dressing gowns that he would wear to bed. The Queen kept these for decades, and even after his death would insist that the rooms that Albert frequented were kept as if he was still alive. But these were normal requests for a woman to want reminders of her husband to be placed in her coffin, and she also asked for the wedding ring of her and her husband to be placed with her also. Another memento from her wedding was her lace wedding veil, and Victoria had requested that the lace veil she wore when she married Prince Albert should be placed on her when she was buried. Victoria may have spent a large part of her life dressed in black, but by wearing her symbolic white veil, it showed that her days of mourning and sadness were over, and she believed she would be reunited with her husband. She even requested the public to wear white, but she also wanted further jewels and pieces of jewellery to be placed on her body. She asked for as much of her jewellery as possible, and was buried with a ring on every finger, and her neck covered in necklaces, and also many bracelets on her wrists. Also requested for her coffin was a cape that her deceased daughter Alice had made as a young princess for Prince Albert. Victoria was incredibly close to Alice, but in 1878 she died from diphtheria, and she was the first of Queen Victoria's children to die, and this had a huge impact on the British monarch, and she never recovered from this loss. The cape was a reminder of her daughter and also her husband. Victoria also loved Scotland, and she would spend a lot of her time in Balmoral, one of her homes, and she loved being out in the Scottish Highlands. She asked that a small bouquet of Scottish heather should be placed inside of her coffin also. But then, there were many strange requests made by Victoria, which would have caused some distress to the royal family. She had insisted that she did not want to be embalmed or have a death mask cast, but her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, would insist on this happening, and a death mask was cast. But inside of the coffin, a number of strange and bizarre items were placed. Throughout her life, there had been much rumour regarding Victoria, especially following Albert's death, and a possible romantic relationship she may have had with one of her servants, a Scottish man named John Brown. John Brown was a no-nonsense man who would not shy away from telling the Queen when she was wearing something he did not like. Brown was one of the only few people who the Queen would listen to, and he would be the master of her horse, and at times he helped the Queen massively. He would save her from serious injury during a carriage accident, and many historians have come to speculate that the Queen actually loved John Brown. Others have gone further and have alluded to the fact that John Brown and Victoria may have even been married, or that they may have had a child together. But this has not been confirmed, and never will be. But the relationship she had with her Scottish servant was close, and it was very possible and probable that the pair did love each other. But Brown would not be everyone's cup of tea. He was a man who was brash and rather uncouth. But the Queen loved this. She loved being told straight. Her children and her heir, Edward VII, would hate Brown, and he would, following Victoria's death, remove and hide most of the memorials that Victoria had made to Brown following his death, following an alcohol-related illness. But what was surprising is that in secret, Victoria, away from the ears of her family and children, requested to the doctor that a lock of John Brown's hair, that she had kept for decades, was to be placed into her coffin. By doing this, she may have wanted her close companion and friend to remain with her to the grave. But Victoria would demand a picture of Brown should be placed in the coffin also, and this was placed in her left hand, and was hidden from the royal family's gaze when they viewed her body by a carefully positioned bouquet of flowers. Victoria may have opened up about her love for Brown, as she would say following his death. Brown was the best, truest heart that ever beat. And she would also write that he had no thought but for me, my welfare, my comfort, my safety, my happiness, courage, unselfish, totally disinterested, discreet to the highest degree, speaking the truth fearlessly and telling me what he thought, and considered to be just and right, without flattery, and without saying what would be pleasing if he did not think it right. The comfort of my daily life is gone. The void is terrible. The loss is irreparable. It was like she had lost a second husband, and she did almost allude to this in her writing. Her diaries, interestingly, were doctored and altered following her death, so that they really may have been lost to time, and that may have been more shocking than it's believed. But with regards to her relationship with John Brown, the strangest request for Victoria's coffin was the wedding ring of John Brown's mother to be placed in her coffin, and this was actually placed on her finger after her death. The significance of this is shocking. Based on tradition, the wedding ring of a mother would be given to a son to propose to a woman with. Why did Victoria have this incredibly important piece of jewellery? Did John Brown propose and give her this ring with the intentions to marry the Queen? A priest on his deathbed would confess that he did marry Victoria to Brown, but this has yet again been disputed. But what is shocking is the request that Victoria made to be buried with this ring. A wedding ring is a symbol of partnership and love, and of a binding union, and Victoria wanted to remain in death bound to John Brown, a man she may have loved and most probably did love. The symbolism of the items relating to John Brown in Victoria's coffin is huge, especially as the royal family disliked him, and many accused him of wielding and holding significant power over Victoria. Her children believed she was influenced too much by Brown, but it was clear that in death Victoria wanted to be close to him again. If the royal family at the time would have found out about these items sneakily being placed in her coffin, they would have been furious, and all hell would have broken loose inside of the rooms where Victoria took her final moments. The requests for these items to go inside of her coffin were unique and strange, and they did, in their best part, symbolise the life of one of the most influential monarchs that Britain has ever had. Victoria oversaw a huge amount of change throughout her life, but her funeral would not go very well at all, and it was a rather calamitous thing in places. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.